We're now going to be using Carbon Scatter to add elements to the scene I have. It's just a very basic wood structure, and what I want to use Carbon Scatter for is to take these tiles that I have and create a pathway down the structure on both sides. The tiles themselves do have a displacement map on them, so there is a little bit of a gap between them, except for when they're rendered. You can see the edges are now filled in. The shadow is kind of darkening that a bit, but you can still see that gap is pretty much gone. So we just need to keep that in mind while we fill this in. So there are different ways we can control Carbon Scatter instances and spread this out. I think for this distribution, the easiest thing to do is to just create a simple object of the pathway. Basically something we can use as a dummy object that will not render, but we can use to add objects to it onto the surface. The dirt I have set up in the dirt object has a displacer on it. If you take a look at the object itself, so there is a displacement, and that's going to make it difficult to use this object for that purpose, because the variability, it's going to change our tiles going up and down depending on where that surface instance shows up. So these I want to have on a level surface, and we're going to use a different object for this. I do have a ground object, which is basically a cube, but what I want to do is create a new plane, or even take the current dirt plane. We can copy and paste it, and I can get rid of the displacer, and then also get rid of the additional segments. So I can also get rid of the material tag on that, and we're just going to raise it up. The objects themselves will be connected to this object, so we can move it up and down after the population is created. So what I want to do now is just hit C on the keyboard, or select the Make Editable command, and that's going to turn this into polygons. So we're going to switch over to the top view, and I'm going to be using the knife tool. So K on the keyboard will bring up the knife tool, and just going to set this to a line. If we hold on Shift, it should constrain it. And we just want to choose where our pathway is going to lay out. And then we're going to go in the other direction. And what we're going to be doing is extracting these polygons. So it's just selecting these ones. And what we want to do is use the modeling command, or the functions. So go to functions, and then you can choose split. This is going to create another object that's just going to contain that selection. So we can call this pathway. Now, the way the distribution is set up, in the way we're going to have to create the instances, we might end up with more in one direction than on the other. So we might have to even separate this even more and maybe pull out the sides and set up two populations, but we'll take a look at it first and see how well just this object itself works. So we'll take that dirt dummy object, and we could just hide it from the render from the scene. Also, one thing I want to note is when you do use the hide from render and hide from the viewport options, that is going to also affect any instances and that are connected to it. So the dummy object itself is going to need a separate tag or even a material to make sure that it doesn't render the object itself, but does render our instances. One thing you can do with a material, if the compositing tag doesn't work for you, or depending on the application you're using Carbon Scatter with, you may not have the same sort of option. A material that we could create for this would be basically to have no color, turn on an alpha channel, no specular channel, and basically just create a white color, in this case for an alpha. And if we move this onto the pathway, we'll then have something that isn't going to render. This should work out okay, although sometimes I notice like if I was to create a copy of the object and paste it and have a duplicate object, say if I was going to do that with the dirt, and then have the alpha on one of those copies, sometimes the shadows can be a little weird, even though the object technically shouldn't be rendering because the alpha. You can also use the pre-multiplied. For the most part, this shouldn't show anything, but I'm going to choose to use a tag instead. We can use that later to make sure it doesn't show in the viewport, but I do want to show the object now. We're going to add a Cinema 4D tag compositing, and in the compositing options we're basically going to turn off everything for the most part. Cast shadows, receive shadows seen by cameras, rays, the GI, transparency, and just make sure all those options are checked off. What that'll do is make sure that it just doesn't render, but we can use this tag to make sure that the instances do render instead, because the compositing tag does not affect Carbon Scatter instances. So the Carbon Scatter pull down from the top, I've just brought into my interface. So we've got Paint, Populate Objects, the options, and then Clear All Ecosystems. The other one here is for just the help options. So select the pathway, and then I'm going to make sure I'm in the model mode, and we're going to select Populate Objects. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add in native object, which is going to give us our list of all the Cinema 4D objects, all the objects within the scene that can be used, keeping in mind that there are different types of objects that will not be available, primarily any sort of instance objects. So you pretty much want to work with just a polygonal object that with any deformers baked onto it, and all of that set up already. So I'm going to expand my path tiles, and I'm going to add in each one of my tiles. Now, the biggest difference between these tiles, because they are basically the same, what I've done is just taken the UV map and rotated it, because it does have a seamless texture, but in order to reduce the tiling effect and making it look like it's the same texture over and over, I have gone ahead and just modified the UV. And we can take a look at that a little bit later. So right now, without making any changes, I'm just going to populate it. And what we're going to see right now is just a box representing the outside, all of our different scale variations, and then we have the total amount of instances. So right now there are 624. We also have the scaling changes, and I think what I'm going to do for now is change the display quality to geometry. And that way we'll be able to see things a little better. And get kind of a better idea of what's going on. So one thing I want to do is remove that scaling change. So what we can do is go to Scaling and Orientation. And whenever it's set to a uniform scale, it will give you one option that controls all three. So the overall scale variation is just controlled by X, and that's going to be uniform throughout. So if we say scale of 3, our overall scale change is going to be that of 3 with uniform. If it's non-uniform, then it's only going to scale the X up to 3, and the rest are going to be defined by that Y and Z amount. So let's bring it to uniform, and I don't want any scale variation. So we can bring it down to 0. Now the way these are scattered throughout, we do want something that is really uniform. Also, I'm going to take the direction from surface and bring it to vertical, and that way we don't have any tilting that we don't want. Because the plane is, or these polygons are flat, it really shouldn't have too much of an impact in this case, but we can control that later, and that will conform to the normal. Under density, we have a couple of different options. What we can do is force the regular alignment of the instances and populate. And this is going to set up and make the rotation basically a fixed amount. So when we take a look at the object, we do see a lot of random rotation. That is controlled underneath the Scaling and Orientation tab. We've got rotation of 120 degrees maximum. So everything starts out in basically the same position, the same rotation value, and then it is rotated with this maximum rotation. If we set it to, let's say, all axes, and take a look at that again, and populate, we're going to see it all over the place. So then every axis is being used instead of just the up axis. So I am going to set that to up axis only and bring the maximum rotation down to 0. So now we're going to have a very even surface, and now we do have a bit of overlapping. So if we go to the density, there is an option to avoid overlapping instances, but when force regular alignment of instances is turned on, that option isn't available. So what we can do is control the density. And now I do have those original 3 objects showing. They are within a null object, so I will be able to hide those. Right now they're still showing up throughout there, and we'll go ahead and hide those a little later. So now I'm populating it. It's still filling it in too much. So if we turn off force regular alignment of instances, we can turn on avoid overlapping instances. This will place our objects a little more randomly, which is not what we want, but just wanted to show you exactly what it would look like, because in this case, I mean, it is a tempting looking feature to be able to avoid them, but it doesn't work when you have the alignment set. So force regular alignment of instances, and we're going to control the density until we can get it down to a point where we don't have as much overlapping. Now, we may need to go back to that object and maybe scale it down a bit, because it is going to basically fit this in to that space and the area. So if we need to, we can make some modifications. Now, if you take a look, what we're seeing is we have 4 showing up in one direction and 3 in the other. Well, I want them to be equal, and this is caused by just where these lines are showing up, because it is going to be even amount of lines with the spacing equal to the scale of the instance. So what I can do is just probably shift this over a little bit, and then we can move the entire object over if needed, and maybe make scale changes to the end to compensate. am going to see if I can bring the density up to maybe 44 or a little bit higher. See if that works. That did work. And the spacing works really well too. It looks about equal to where it was before. So now I have the distribution of the material being controlled by, as I was saying, those different UV maps. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So we've got our carbon scatter ecosystem. And I just want to show you those path tiles, just what I did with the UV. Now, because each of the tags does have a bit of an offset to show different areas of the surface, they're not going to show up centered within this preview, because it is going to reflect everything changed from the different offset values. But if you take a look, what I did was just basically take the original UV and just rotate it slightly for both. And this one looks more different because it actually does have a higher polygon count. And that was to help the displacement mapping a little better. And I might go ahead and replace these other ones with that higher res one. But for now, we'll go ahead and just stick with what we have. So obviously the biggest problem that we're going to have is, since there's no rotation with any of these objects, even though that UV map is changed to modify the texture, these patterns are going to show up, and it's going to look like we have just duplicated the same tile. So we want to avoid that. What we want to do is use carbon scatter for the rotation, in additional rotations, using a function. And that way we can have a lot more variability. So in order to see or get back to this object, we're going to go back to the pathway, select the object, make sure you're in the model mode, or object mode should work as well, and go to carbon scatter options, and we're just go back to populate object, and it's going to bring back our ecosystem. So if we go over to scaling and orientation, obviously if we start modifying the rotation amount, we're going to get some values that we just don't want, because this is going to be just a random rotation based on kind of an internal noise within the ecosystem, and it's really just a maximum rotation, so we need to use a function in order to control it in a finite amount. What I want to do is, I do have another object I'm going to be adding to these tiles, and I might even need to re-add them in order to get them to refresh properly. We'll take a look. Basically what I've created is an axis object, and I want to set this on top of or as part of each of the individual tiles. So we're going to make a couple copies of it. And first I'm just going to add it all to the path tiles. These are not centered, so I'm going to go ahead and center all the tiles, and then add the axis to each one. Now if we go back to that pathway, populate the object, we're going to see if it's going to refresh for us. It might show up in the render, those new objects added. It doesn't look like they're going to. So we will need to re-add the object. Basically what I mean by this is that we're going to have to clear the ecosystem, clear all the ecosystems, and reset it up because it's kind of easy to think of carbon scatter as a post effect, because there are a few limited options based on the refresh, and sometimes you really just can't get it to refresh except by adding the objects back in. Now, when I went to re-add the objects, it did end up crashing the program on me. So what I've done to set up this example instead is just add a temporary material, which is basically going to have a gradient from black to red along the x-axis. So this is going to show us a little bit better how the distribution is going to work. So I won't be using these for the final, and it's really just something to demonstrate it. So what I'm going to do is just hide the path tiles, and as long as you hide the apparent object from the render in the scene, it won't affect the instances. So we're going to go back to the pathway object, which I did end up creating again, and go to Populate Objects. So I'm going to go back and just add in, and just set this up the way it was before, and then we'll take a look at the orientation options. Okay, so here's the filled in population, and because now we don't have that material difference between the objects, we can see the distribution much clearer, which is basically everything is in the same rotation, has the same orientation value. So what we're going to do is use that up axis rotation. Now we can't really use the all axis mode for this because it's going to be way too difficult to find each of the individual values. It's kind of hard to control in order to get it to be flat, if it's even possible. Sometimes it's just not possible in order to get it oriented correctly. So we're going to use up axis only, and a lot of times you can do this to get an idea of the control within the function editor. Let's say we want our rotation to be 90 degrees. So we're going to go ahead and type in 90, and then we're going to extract the parameter to open up the function editor. What it's going to do is create a constant node within the function editor. In this case, it's created one of 0. So 0 might be equal to 90. I'm going to go ahead and double check that, try to get something that isn't 0. And it does look like something just happened here with... Okay, so if your interface ever disappears like that, you can go to Mix Material, then back to the ecosystem, and everything is still remembered. So we're going to go to scaling and orientation. I'm going to go ahead and type in 45, extract it, and now we can see a constant number of negative 0.5. So in most cases, whatever the value you've entered in before you extract, the constant node is going to be the equivalent function value to that rotation. So right now it's set up to negative 0.5. We're going to go ahead and populate it, and now we have a 45-degree rotation. So it does look like the actual value is somewhat off, because if we were to rotate this 45 degrees, obviously it would look more like diamonds intersecting rather than showing up correctly. Now, what I know is that our value for controlling the rotation is at -1 for our constant. The value is about 180 degrees different from the starting value. at -2, we'll see our original starting point, which is equal to the rotation being 0 rotation with the slider. Now if we set this value to 0 and populate, we're going to see no change at all. Because throughout a value of 2, so -2 to 0, is going to give us our full amount of rotation. You can use any value between 2, so you could do -1 to 1, which is the typical setting, just remembering that the -1 is what you'll need in order to, or the -2 to set the original position, so you kind of have to offset it a little bit. So 0 is going to be your original position, and then you could set it up to, say, -1 for your low value, and a value of 1 for the high value of the rotation, and that will give you a full range. So what we want to do is use a noise or some sort of control in order to make that a variable. So let's go ahead and add in a noise, and just a noise node. And the output typically of a noise node is -1 to 1. And click OK and populate. Now what we're going to notice is obviously we have a lot of these in-between values. We do need it to be a fixed amount, so either it rotates 90 degrees, 180 degrees, 270, or 360. We don't want it to fall outside of that range, because otherwise we're going to have this overlapping. So I am going to switch my mapping mode over to world standard, so that way when we're working with functions, it's going to be based on the coordinates that you have set for your document coordinate within Cinema 4D. So going to attributes, you can select document, and then you can see my document scale is 1 centimeter, and it is automatically going to be scaled to equal that in the world mode. So everything within the function editor is going to be scaled correctly. So we can bring our value down to, say, 50 centimeters. Now the features within noises are actually about double the input size. That's just the way Carbon Scatter works, which is based off of the view function editor. So I did do a comparison between view in the function editor and different scales, using Extreme and also standalone, and then taking a look at Carbon Scatter, and it really is identical for the settings. So that's how I know that the coordinate is set up correctly, but most noises are really going to be, if we type in 50 centimeters, our largest scale feature that we're going to see, and the same thing with fractals, it's going to be about double that amount. And if you modify the vector in order to correct that, to make that half, then the origin will not work correctly. So one thing to keep in mind. What we want to do is modify this to create those finite values. So what we can do is add a filter to the link. So selecting that link between the orientation and the value, and then selecting the filter. You could also select orientation down at the bottom and add a filter. If selecting the line is easier, select the line. If checking the bottom is easier, then use that. There are different ways to set that up. For the filter, what we're going to use is quantize. And the default for this should be fine. 4 steps is what we want. And we're going to make sure that those work correctly. Let's go ahead and hit populate. And now you can see the distribution of the rotation, and it is constrained to those values either going 90 degrees or 180 or 270. We could open up the range a lot more by expanding the output value of this. So we can increase our contrast in order to get more information. Modify brightness. Or we could expand and do more steps. Right now we're going between -1 and 1, but if we wanted to go between -2 and 2, what we could do is set our step amount to 8. And then we need to use what's called a map filter to basically extend the range. So adding another filter and selecting map, changing our input range, which is currently, actually we don't need to change it, it is -1 to 1, which is what we're seeing output by the function node preview. And then we're going to change that output range to equal -2 to 2. And that should work to fall within the correct range. And now we have even more variation. So 4 was to equal from -1 to 1, and 8 steps to equal -2 to 2, but haven't used the map filter. But you can see a lot more variation within the tiles and how they're distributed, and that's really going to help spread out those textures. Now, I'm also going to go ahead and save this function out so I can reload it in case I need to refresh or clear the ecosystem to refresh the object material. But what I want to do first is add a tiny bit more variability by going outside the range so that we're not ending on -2 and starting on going from -2 to 2 for the output range, because we're ending on the same number, basically the same rotation. It'll look identical. So I want to add one additional step to this. So we're going to go to that quantize filter and bring it up to 9 steps. And now we need to distribute the map. And I'm going to do the lower range and set it to -2.5. So we're adding a 0.5 to equal the extra step. So for every step you add, you would increase by 0.5 up or down. Click OK. Populate. And now we have something that looks a little bit better. So we're going from the lower to the upper range, a little more variability, and we can change the scale a little bit more if we need to. We could also mix it with other fractals as well. But what I want to do is save this out as basically a function. At this point, we can only save it as a material in order to get that information passed over. But that's going to make it kind of difficult to load it in for other objects and other types of materials, because it's going to overwrite everything. So what we want to do is temporarily connect it to a different channel. In this case, I'm going to connect it to the variable scaling. And that way we can save out the function. So we can right-click now on this variable scaling and save the function. I'm now in my installation content folder for functions. I'm going to add a new folder called orientation and just call this even rotation. And go ahead and save it. So now if we want to load that in, we can right-click, load the function. And I just need to add that orientation as a new collection. So we can go down to the lower left, add a new collection. We could also re-add the entire collection but since most of that's already added in, it'll only add the different functions that are either in the host folder, the function folder, or any new folders will now refresh. And we can also go ahead down to the bottom and lock these collections so that they don't get moved around, because sometimes they'll be selected. When you go to click on another folder, it'll just move the collection. So that's why that lock option is there. So if we want to load that in, we go to even rotation, load it, and then if we were to say we didn't have this set up, we no longer see that output. We could either go into the function editor, add an output, and just choose the output. So in this case, orientation. Or we can just go in and re-extract that. And then we can connect it, and disconnect the scaling, turn off that variable scaling, and we're back to where we were. Now the orientation itself does have different options here. We were just controlling it from -1 to 1. Which is a much easier way, I think, to control it, because it really reduces the total amounts, at least for this sort of a setup. If you choose it over to standard, then the output range is going to be changed from 0 to 180, so up to 180 degrees, by using an actual output of 180. But most view functions go from -1 to 1, unless you're really using a lot of filters and increasing contrast. But even then, reaching that 180 would require the map filter to be set from, in this case, 0 to 180, or maybe a little bit larger to extend the value. So we are going to use the parametric -1 to 1 mode. So now I'm going to go ahead and just click OK, and I want to remove those other materials that I added. Go to the pathway, populate the object, and just see if I can get a refresh. One way to check and really see whether or not it's going to show up correctly is to go to the instance object, go to proxy options, and edit material. And what it's doing is selecting that material, showing two elements, and showing other material which I deleted. So it did not refresh. So we may have to just go ahead and remove those from the list. I'm going to remove it, and I'm going to re-add that first one in. So if I delete it and add it back in and then repopulate, it is going to refresh. So I just need to remove the other instances and re-add them in, which also means I do need to set my display quality back. And now we have our pathway. So I need to go back and re-add my compositing tag since I had deleted that before by crashing it. And what we're going to do is take the object, the pathway object, and we can just move that down to intersect with the ground. And now in this case, we no longer see that object in the editor, so I don't need to worry about setting up any materials for the display. That seems to be working all right. So this is a render of that scene. I do want to note, and I did notice this happen earlier, I forgot about it. Once I initiated carbon scatter, the environment object decided not to work anymore. I've noticed this in Cinema 4D happening kind of on and off. in the current release that I've got, and I'm running a release candidate. I'm not sure whether or not it is just because of carbon scatter, or whether or not it's just something to do with Cinema 4D, because I think I may have noticed it while editing light objects and sky objects. So what I do need to do is, what I found is the easiest way is to just add a new environment object, because I'm using this for my ambient light rather than using global illumination right now. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that color and paste it, and then just set the value to 28. Delete the other object. And it looks like that might not have refreshed it. Okay, so I am going to just delete the environment object, add a new one in, deleting it first before editing, and since I did have the color copied, now it's back to normal. So if we take a look, we could probably adjust this and move those objects up a little bit more. Because if we take a look at the dirt, that's not quite what I want. So I'm going to go back to the pathway and move the object up a bit. And I'm going to re-render. Okay, so everything's pretty even right now for the most part. If we want to add a little more variability to it, and its orientation on other axes, or even the level of it going up and down, we could do different heights and placements on the up and down axis. There are a couple of different ways we could do this. Right now we are controlling the orientation and the rotation of the instances with the current function. So we could either mix in some additional numbers to slightly offset it, very small amounts, to have it kind of shift around in different directions. Or what we could do is modify the pathway object itself. Maybe we could knife it a few more times and change the polygon or the points, just moving them up or down a little bit, so then we can have it conform to that shape when we populate it. Let's take a look at just adding a little bit of a mix. So what we could do is go to the function for the orientation, and we are going to select, we can select the orientation output and add in over here on the left a combiner node. We're going to set this to blender, which is the default, unless you've selected a previous blender of a different kind, or a previous combiner. So if we have a combiner right here that's multiply inputs is what's set. Now I select the link and go and add another combiner. It's going to duplicate that previous selection. I also want to note that I do have the show parameter connections turned on over on the right. And if we go up to the upper left, we can change our preview options. I'm going to set this to 2D plane so we can see it a little bit better. We could also change our scale if needed, but this should work pretty well. What I want to do is blend this together with another noise or a fractal. So we have noise nodes and fractal nodes. Fractals are much more complex. We could just use a simple fractal and just go ahead and set our largest feature to say 2 meters. Connect this to the altitude output of that fractal, and we have just a little bit of a change. And what I want to do is add this amount, and let's go ahead and set it to 0.1 to begin with. So just went ahead and connected input 1. Input 0 is the first connection, which was connected to the prior chain. Input 1 is connected to our fractal. And now we can adjust the ratio amount or the blend amount. So we're adding either all of it or just a small amount, in this case 0.1. If we had it on the blend mode, a value of 1 is going to overwrite the previous value. So let's just go ahead and set that to 0.1 and populate. And now we see a little bit of a change in our rotation. All the tiles are being offset basically in the same direction. So what we want to do is change that over to multiply mode. Now we're going to have to really reduce this number in our combination or ratio amount. Let's go ahead and set it to 0.01 and repopulate, and that's still a bit much. So let's try 0.003. And that works a little bit better. So we have a better looking rotation variability. It's not identical for everything. It is offset a little bit more. And that should work pretty well for now. Also, as I was saying, we could offset the up and down position. So if we go to density, we can set the offset from the surface, and we can go ahead and just use an absolute amount. So if we want to test it first, let's go ahead and type in a value of 0.1, which is obviously a lot, 0.01, 10 millimeters, and then compare to 0, and maybe we'll use 5 millimeters then as our max. So go ahead and type it in. Actually, type in 5 millimeters, and then extract it. And there's our value. We can go ahead, and it actually should be a little bit higher than that. We'll have to key it in. Let's go ahead and key it in to this amount first. Just a constant and check. It might be a little too high, so let's go ahead and set it to proportional to the size of the instance, which should shrink that down a bit. And now we can use a slightly higher number. Okay, so we're going to use a mix of 0.05. We want something that's going to mix between 0 and 0.05. So if we want, we could even take our distribution before it's connected to any of the filters. Add in a blender. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect that really quick. What I want to do is create two constant nodes. So I'm going to add another constant, and we can type in 0. Technically, if nothing is connected to this ratio, it will be 0, but I just want to manually add in a constant number of 0. Connect our blender combiner node, and use the value output in order to mix these. So typically when we control a ratio, the ratio output should be a value from 0 to 1. Now our actual value is -1 to 1, so what we're going to get is a mix between 0.05, and instead of 0, it's going to go down to -0.05, which is going to lower it instead of raise it. And since this is a small amount, that might be alright. We'll go ahead and take a look at the population, but if we need to, what we could do is within the blender, you can clip the ratio 0 to 1. Now keeping in mind that is going to cut out information, anything below 0. So if you need to, you can add another map filter, input range -1 to 1, and the output 0 to 1. But this looks like it's going to work alright. It's just a very slight offset going up and down, so it does give a little more realism to the objects. Next we're going to add a grass object and fill in around the rest of the structure. And for this, what I want to use is, instead of creating a polygonal object to control it, I'm going to use image-based density within a function. So we'll take a look at setting that out.